The sound of gunfire shattered the pre-dawn silence. Michael Foster bolted upright in his bed, chest heaving, sweat plastering his t-shirt to his skin. For a moment, the walls of his cabin dissolved into the dust-filled air of an Afghan village. He could smell cordite and blood, hear the desperate shouts of men he'd failed to save. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vision faded. The gunfire became the innocent tapping of pine branches against his window. The shouting receded into the hollow emptiness of his remote Appalachian cabin. Michael ran a trembling hand through his salt and pepper hair, his breathing gradually slowing as reality reasserted itself. Another night in Mother Battle fought only in his mind. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, wincing as his right knee protested with a familiar dull ache, a permanent souvenir from an IED on his third tour. The digital clock on his nightstand read 4:53 a.m., close enough to his usual wake-up time. Sleep wouldn't return now anyway. The cabin floor felt ice-cold beneath his bare feet as he made his way to the kitchen. It was a sparse space, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, basic countertops, a wood stove, and little else. No family photos, no decorative touches, nothing that wasn't absolutely necessary. Michael had come to these mountains to escape, not to create a home. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then moved to the window. The first hints of dawn were just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. His 10 acres of forest stretched out before him, the towering pines standing like silent sentinels. This isolation had been his salvation, or so he'd told himself when he purchased the property 11 months ago, with the last of his savings and military pension. The kettle whistled, pulling him from his thoughts. He poured the steaming water over instant coffee in a chipped mug that bore the faded insignia of his old unit. As he took the first bitter sip, his eyes caught movement outside the window. Something was different. Something was wrong. Years of combat training kicked in instantly. Michael set down his mug and reached for the rifle he kept mounted on hooks by the door. Moving with practiced efficiency, he scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of intrusion. That's when he saw them. Footprints in the soft earth around his cabin, not human tracks but animal, large and deliberate, circling his property. Michael's jaw tightened. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out onto the porch, rifle held ready. The crisp morning air bit at his face as he surveyed the perimeter. The tracks were fresh from sometime during the night. They belonged to a large dog methodically patrolling the boundaries of his land. With the careful movements of a man who had survived by being thorough, Michael followed the tracks. They made a complete circuit of his cabin before heading east, toward the deeper forest. He tracked them for nearly a quarter mile before they disappeared into a dense thicket of underbrush. Back at the buy-in, Michael's routine continued with military precision. Chop wood, check supplies, secure perimeter. Each task completed with focused intensity, as if proper execution might keep the ghosts at bay. But the mystery of the dog tracks nagged at him, disrupting the carefully ordered rhythm of his day. The afternoon brought with it a rare October warmth. Michael was splitting logs by the woodshed when he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He straightened, his hand tightening around the axe handle, and turned slowly. There at the edge of the forest stood a German shepherd. Its coat was a striking mix of gray and white, giving it a ghostly appearance against the dark pines. The dog was large and powerful, with the dignified bearing of a soldier. It stood perfectly still, amber eyes fixed on Michael with unsettling intelligence. "Hey there," Michael called, his voice rough from disuse. The dog made no response. It didn't approach, didn't bark, didn't wag its tail. It simply watched him with that same intent focus. Michael noticed the lack of a collar. Not someone's pet, then. A stray, perhaps, or something else entirely. "You hungry?" he asked, setting down the axe and taking a cautious step forward. The dog took a corresponding step back, maintaining the exact same distance between them. A clear message. "I'm watching, but I'm not approaching." There was something about its posture, alert but not aggressive, that struck Michael as oddly familiar. Following an instinct he couldn't quite explain, Michael raised his hand in a quick, specific gesture, a silent command signal used by military dog handlers. The German shepherd's ears immediately pricked forward, its head tilting slightly in recognition. The realization hit Michael like a physical blow. This wasn't just any dog. This was a military-trained service animal, the kind that had saved his life and the lives of his squad members more times than he could count during his deployments. Before he could process this further, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, a branch breaking under someone's weight. The dog's head snapped toward the sound. In an instant, it vanished back into the forest, a gray ghost swallowed by shadows. Michael grabbed his rifle and moved toward the source of the noise, his body automatically falling into the combat stance that had been drilled into him through years of training. He advanced slowly, scanning the tree line, every sense on high alert. "Who's there?" he called, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This is private property." A figure emerged from behind a large oak tree, a man in his 30s wearing an orange vest and carrying a hunting rifle. He raised his hands when he saw Michael's weapon. "Whoa, easy there," the hunter said, eyes wide. "Didn't mean to trespass, just tracking a buck that came this way." Michael's finger remained poised near the trigger, his heart hammered in his chest, vision narrowing dangerously. The hunter's orange vest suddenly looked like the flash of an explosion. The rifle in the man's hands transformed into something more threatening in Michael's mind. "You need to leave," Michael said, his voice tight. "Now." "Sure thing, man. No problem." The hunter backed away slowly, hands still raised. "Sorry to disturb you." As the man retreated, a low, rumbling growl emerged from the underbrush to Michael's right. The German shepherd had reappeared, teeth bared, eyes fixed on the retreating hunter. It stood between Michael and the perceived threat, its posture unmistakably protective. The hunter paled at the sight of the dog. "Jesus, is that yours? Call it off." "He's not mine," Michael replied, lowering his rifle slightly. "But I'd suggest you move along quickly." The man needed no further encouragement. He turned and hurried away, glancing nervously over his shoulder until he disappeared into the trees. When the hunter was gone, the dog's aggressive stance relaxed. It turned to look at Michael, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked in mutual understanding. Then, without a sound, it melted back into the forest. That night, sleep eluded Michael. His mind replayed the afternoon's events on an endless loop. The dog's military training, its protective behavior, the strange feeling of recognition he couldn't shake. There was a story here, buried beneath the surface, and for the first time in months, Michael felt something besides the dull ache of his memories. Curiosity, purpose. Dawn broke to the sound of rain pounding against the cabin roof. Michael sat at his small table, nursing a cup of coffee as he stared out at the gray curtain of water blurring the forest. His medication sat untouched beside him, small white pills prescribed by the VA doctor for his PTSD and depression. He hadn't taken them in 3 days. The doctors had warned him about stopping suddenly. They'd talked about chemical dependency, about the dangers of withdrawal. But the pills dulled everything. Not just the nightmares and the panic, but the world itself. And right now, Michael needed clarity. He needed to understand what was happening with the mysterious dog. He pulled a notebook toward him and began to write, documenting what he'd observed. The tracks, the military training, the protective behavior. The simple act of organizing his thoughts on paper felt good, purposeful, like piecing together intelligence in the field. By midday, the rain had transformed into a full-blown storm. Wind howled around the cabin, bending the pines and pelting the windows with debris. Michael was checking for leaks in the roof when a crash of thunder shook the walls, momentarily drowning out the sound of his radio. He turned up the volume, catching the tail end of a weather report. "Expect flash flooding in low-lying areas. This is shaping up to be the worst storm of the season so far, with winds expected to reach 40 to 50 miles per hour. Residents in rural areas should prepare for potential power outages." Michael mentally cataloged his supplies. He had food, water, candles, and firewood. He'd weathered worse storms in worse conditions. What concerned him was what might be happening in the forest. The strange dog was out there somewhere, and despite its obvious training and capabilities, the storm was fierce enough to threaten any creature caught in its path. At precisely 4:30 p.m., the time when the German shepherd had appeared the previous day, Michael found himself watching the tree line, half expecting to see the gray figure emerge despite the storm. But the forest remained empty, save for the whipping branches and swirling leaves. The dog's absence left an unexpected hollow feeling in Michael's chest. He'd been looking forward to this moment, preparing for it. He'd even set aside a portion of his dinner, a can of beef stew, thinking he might try to earn the animal's trust with food. As dusk approached, the storm intensified. Michael was securing the woodshed when a massive crack split the air. He looked up just in time to see an ancient pine, its roots weakened by the saturated soil, begin to topple. He dove out of the way as the massive trunk crashed down, missing him by mere feet. The fall had left him far from the cabin, rain pelting his face, mud soaking through his clothes. As he struggled to his feet, his bad knee buckled beneath him, sending him back to the ground with a grunt of pain. The wind had picked up to a howl, disorienting him. Sheets of rain reduced visibility to almost nothing. Michael began to crawl, using the fallen tree as a guide, trying to orient himself toward the cabin. But the pain in his knee was blinding, the cold rain numbing his fingers. A wave of dizziness, possibly from the medication withdrawal, possibly from the pain, washed over him. For a moment, the storm around him blurred with memories of another time when he'd been pinned down, injured, with no clear path to safety. Then, through the curtain of rain, he saw a shape moving toward him, gray and white against the darkness. The German shepherd materialized beside him, its fur soaked but its eyes clear and purposeful. It barked once, sharp, commanding, then tugged at his jacket sleeve with gentle teeth. Michael allowed himself to be guided, leaning slightly against the dog's solid frame as they made their way slowly back toward the cabin. The animal seemed to know exactly where to go, choosing the clearest path, pausing whenever Michael needed to rest his damaged knee. When they finally reached the porch steps, Michael was shivering uncontrollably. The dog stayed beside him, pressed against his leg, as he fumbled with the door. Inside, he collapsed into the nearest chair, his sodden clothes creating puddles on the wooden floor. The German shepherd remained at the threshold, watching him intently but not entering. "Come in," Michael said through chattering teeth. "It's okay." The dog hesitated, then stepped inside, shaking itself vigorously before moving to sit near the cold wood stove. Its eyes never left Michael. With trembling hands, Michael stripped off his wet clothes and pulled on dry ones. He built a fire in the stove, the warmth gradually seeping back into his bones. All the while, the dog observed him with that same intelligent focus. "Thank you," Michael said quietly when he could speak normally again. "I think you might have saved my life out there." The dog cocked its head as if considering his words. Michael retrieved a towel and cautiously approached the animal. It allowed him to dry its fur, sitting perfectly still under his ministrations. Up close, Michael could see the signs of age in the dog's face. Gray around the muzzle, a certain wisdom in the amber eyes. This was no young animal, but it was clearly still powerful and capable. "You need a name," Michael said, running the towel gently over the dog's back. "I can't just keep calling you in my head." The German shepherd watched him expectantly. "Scout," Michael decided, "because you seem to be patrolling, keeping watch. That sound okay to you?" The newly named Scout gave no objection, simply continuing its calm assessment of Michael. When the dog was dry, Michael opened a can of beef stew and poured half into a bowl, which he placed on the floor. Scout approached cautiously, sniffed the offering, then began to eat with restrained eagerness that suggested it hadn't had a proper meal in some time. As the storm raged outside, Michael sat by the fire, watching Scout finish the food. There was something profoundly comforting about the animal's presence. For the first time since moving to the cabin, the silence inside didn't feel oppressive. It felt shared. "Where did you come from, Scout?" Michael murmured. "Who trained you?" Scout looked up from the empty bowl, then moved to sit beside Michael's chair. After a moment's hesitation, Michael reached down to stroke the dog's head. Scout leaned into the touch, a gesture of trust that felt significant. The radio crackled on the counter, cutting through the comfortable silence. "Authorities are asking for the public's help in locating William Hayes, an 84-year-old veteran who went missing from his home in Piney Ridge 3 days ago. Hayes, who suffers from a heart condition, was last seen walking his dog in the national forest. Search efforts have been hampered by the current weather conditions." Michael's hand froze on Scout's head. The dog had gone perfectly still, ears pricked forward at the sound of the radio. When the name William Hayes was mentioned, Scout let out a soft whine. "You know that name, don't you?" Michael said quietly. "Is that your owner, this William Hayes?" Scout stood and moved to the door, looking back at Michael expectantly. "We can't go out there now," Michael said, gesturing to the window where rain lashed against the glass. "The storm's too dangerous. If Hayes is your owner, we'll look for him when the weather clears." Scout whined again but returned to Michael's side, settling on the floor with a heavy sigh. That night, Michael allowed Scout to stay inside. The dog chose a spot near the bed, positioning itself where it could see both Michael and the door, a sentry on duty. Despite the storm still battering the cabin, Michael fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in months. The nightmare, when it came, was different from the usual battlefield horrors. This time, Michael was wandering through a dark forest, searching for something important. He could hear someone calling for help, a voice that seemed achingly familiar. He followed the sound, moving deeper into the trees, but the voice always remained just out of reach. Then the ground gave way beneath his feet, and he was falling. Michael jerked awake with a grumping. Scout was standing beside the bed, paw on the mattress, eyes gleaming in the darkness. The dog had woken him, pulling him from the nightmare before it could fully take hold. "Good dog," Michael whispered, reaching out to touch Scout's head. "Good dog." As dawn broke, the storm began to subside. Michael stood on the porch, watching as the clouds gradually thinned, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce through. Scout sat beside him, alert and focused on the forest. "You want to go find him, don't you?" Michael said. "Your owner." Scout's tail thumped once against the wooden planks. Michael considered his options. The smart thing would be to call the authorities, tell them about Scout, let them handle the search. But the thought of dealing with strangers, of explaining himself, of the questions they would ask, it made his chest tighten uncomfortably. Besides, Scout had found Michael in the storm. The dog clearly had tracking abilities beyond what any search party could muster. And if William Hayes was indeed a veteran, as the radio had said, then there was a deeper obligation at play. "You didn't leave a fellow soldier behind." "All right," Michael said finally. "We'll go look for him, but you'll have to lead the way." He packed a small bag with essentials: first aid kit, water, energy bars, flashlight, knife. He strapped his sidearm to his hip, a habit from his military days that he hadn't been able to break. The mountains might be peaceful, but they weren't without dangers. Scout watched these preparations with obvious approval, moving to the door as soon as Michael shouldered his pack. "Let's go find your owner," Michael said, opening the door. Scout bounded down the steps and into the clearing, then paused, looking back to ensure Michael was following. Together they headed into the forest, Scout leading with confident purpose. The aftermath of the storm was evident everywhere: fallen branches, muddy ground, swollen streams. Scout navigated these obstacles effortlessly, occasionally circling back when Michael struggled with his bad knee on the uneven terrain. They had been traveling for nearly an hour when Scout suddenly stopped, head raised, testing the air. The dog changed direction, moving with new urgency. Michael followed, pushing through wet underbrush, his boots sinking into the sodden ground. They emerged into a small clearing where a modest A-frame cabin stood. Unlike Michael's utilitarian dwelling, this place had the look of a long-established home. Flower boxes hung from the windows, though the plants inside were drooping from neglect. A small shed stood to one side, its door swinging open in the light breeze. Scout let out a bark, the first sound Michael had heard from the dog besides growls and whines, and raced toward the cabin. Michael followed more cautiously, hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "Hello?" he called. "Anyone here? Mr. Hayes?" No response came from the cabin. Scout was now pawing at the door, whining with distress. Michael approached and found the door unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, bracing himself for what he might find. The interior of the cabin was neat but showed signs of a hasty departure. A coffee mug half full on the table, a book lying open on the sofa. Photos lined the walls, many showing a much younger Scout alongside an elderly man with kind eyes and the ramrod-straight posture of military bearing. Other photos featured a smiling woman with silver hair, presumably Mrs. Hayes, and a young man in modern military fatigues. Scout moved through the cabin with clear familiarity, sniffing intensely at a pair of muddy boots by the door. The dog then looked up at Michael with an expression that somehow conveyed both urgency and expectation. "He's not here," Michael said, stating the obvious. "Do you know where he went, Scout? Can you find him?" In response, Scout moved to the open door and barked once before heading back into the woods. Michael followed, noting that they were now moving downhill toward a small stream he could hear rushing with storm runoff. The terrain grew steeper, slicker with mud. Michael's knee protested with each step, but he pushed through the pain, keeping his eyes on Scout's gray form weaving through the trees ahead. They reached the stream, now a swollen, angry torrent, and Scout began moving along its bank, nose to the ground. Michael followed carefully, aware that the banks could be unstable after the heavy rains. It was Scout's sudden, distressed bark that alerted him. The dog had stopped about 50 yards downstream, pawing at something half hidden in the mud of the bank. As Michael approached, his heart sank. There, partially submerged in the mud, lay an elderly man. William Hayes was on his side, one arm outstretched as if he had been trying to pull himself up the bank. His eyes were closed, his skin alarmingly pale beneath a shock of white hair. Michael dropped to his knees beside the fallen veteran, years of combat medical training taking over. He pressed fingers to the man's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak and irregular, but present. Hayes was alive, but barely. "Mr. Hayes," Michael called, gently turning the man onto his back. "Can you hear me?" Hayes's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. His breathing was shallow, labored. Scout whined, nosing at his owner's hand. Michael assessed the situation quickly. Hayes was hypothermic, probably had been out in the storm for hours. There was a nasty gash on his forehead. He'd likely fallen down the steep bank, perhaps while trying to get home before the storm hit its peak. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to help you," Michael said firmly, unsure if the man could hear him, but needing to establish the plan aloud. "I'm Michael Foster. Your dog found me. We're going to get you home." Hayes was too heavy for Michael to carry alone, especially with his bad knee in the treacherous terrain. He needed to warm the man first, get him stabilized, before attempting to move him. Michael shrugged off his pack and pulled out the emergency blanket he always carried. He wrapped it around Hayes, then used his body heat to begin warming the elderly veteran, all while checking vital signs. Scout pressed against Hayes's other side, lending additional warmth. "Come on, sir," Michael murmured. "Stay with us. Your dog went through a lot of trouble to find help." Slowly, agonizingly, Hayes's skin began to warm. His pulse strengthened slightly. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, the elderly man's eyes cracked open. "Margaret," he whispered, voice barely audible. "No, sir. My name is Michael. Your dog found me. We're going to get you home." Hayes's gaze shifted, focusing with the difficulty. "Delta," he murmured. Scout, or Delta, apparently, whined softly and licked the old man's hand. "That's right," Michael said. "Delta's here. He found help." Hayes's eyes drifted closed again, but his breathing seemed stronger. Michael decided they couldn't wait any longer. They needed to get Hayes to proper shelter. "Sir, I need to move you. It's going to hurt, but we have to get you somewhere warm and dry. Do you understand?" A faint nod was the only response. With considerable effort, Michael managed to get Hayes into a sitting position. Then, with a grunt of pain as his knee protested, he hoisted the elderly man up and over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The weight was substantial, and Michael's knee threatened to buckle, but he gritted his teeth and began the slow, painful journey back up the hill. Delta moved ahead, seemingly understanding the need to find the easiest path. The dog would go forward, then return, guiding Michael along the gentlest slope, avoiding hidden obstacles. The journey back to Hayes's cabin was a blur of pain and determination for Michael. His world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the weight on his shoulders. At some point, it stopped being William Hayes he was carrying and became every fallen comrade he'd ever evacuated from a hot zone. His mind slipped between past and present, the Afghan mountains blending with the Appalachian forest. When they finally reached the cabin, Michael was on the verge of collapse. He managed to get Hayes inside and onto the sofa before his knee finally gave out. He crashed to the floor, gasping with pain and exhaustion. Delta moved between the two men, whining softly, clearly distressed by their conditions. The dog nosed at Hayes, then at Michael, as if trying to determine who needed help more urgently. I'm okay, Michael assured the dog, pulling himself up to check on Hayes. The elderly man was still dangerously cold, his clothes soaked through. Michael found the bedroom and retrieved dry clothes and blankets. With methodical efficiency, he changed Hayes out of his wet garments, wrapped him in layers of warmth, and elevated his feet. Throughout the process, Hayes drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring names Michael didn't recognize. Once Hayes was stable, Michael built a fire in the cabin's wood stove, filling the space with life-giving warmth. He found Hayes's medication in the bathroom cabinet, heart pills, just as the radio report had mentioned, and coaxed the elderly man into taking them with small sips of water. Delta never left Hayes's side, maintaining a vigilant watch over his owner. The dog's devotion was palpable, a physical manifestation of loyalty that struck Michael deeply. As the day progressed, Hayes became more lucid. His eyes, a faded blue that must once have been striking, focused on Michael with growing clarity. "You military?" he asked, voice stronger though still rough. Michael nodded. "Army, 3 tours in Afghanistan." Hayes's gaze sharpened. "Delta found you." "Yes, sir. He's been watching my cabin for a while now. Yesterday he helped me during the storm. Today he led me to you." A ghost of a smile touched Hayes's weathered face. "Good dog," he murmured, reaching a trembling hand to stroke Delta's head. "Always knew what needed doing." Michael offered Hayes some warm broth he'd found in the kitchen cupboards. As the elderly man sipped slowly, Michael noticed a photograph on the side table. The young soldier from the other pictures, standing proudly in desert fatigues, arm around a military working dog that was unmistakably a younger Delta. "Your son?" Michael asked, nodding toward the photo. Hayes's eyes followed Michael's gaze, a profound sadness settling over his features. "Robert," he said softly. "My boy. Afghanistan, 2018. Delta was his partner. They sent the dog home to us after—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Michael understood all too well. A flag-draped coffin, a folded triangle of stars, a nation's gratitude that couldn't fill the hole left behind. "I'm sorry," Michael said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. Hayes nodded, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "Robert always said Delta was the best partner he could have asked for. Said that dog saved his unit more times than he could count." His gaze shifted to Michael. "Were you there? In 18? Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with his damp clothes. "Yet," he said quietly, "Kunar province. Until April." Something flickered in Hayes's eyes, a question, perhaps, or a recognition. But whatever it was, he didn't voice it. Instead, he sank back against the pillows, suddenly looking every one of his 84 years. "Need to rest," he murmured, eyes drifting closed. "Yes, sir," Michael replied. "I'll be here." As Hayes slept, Michael explored the cabin, trying to piece together the story of its occupants. The walls were a timeline of William Hayes's life. Photos of his youth in uniform during the Korean War, his wedding to Margaret, the birth and growth of their son Robert, and finally Robert's own military career. In the small study, Michael found a wall dedicated to Robert's service. Medals in a display case, unit patches, and letters, dozens of them, neatly preserved in plastic sleeves. Michael wouldn't have read them, but a familiar insignia caught his eye. The same unit patch he had worn on his own uniform. With trembling fingers, he pulled one letter from its sleeve. The handwriting was neat, precise. "Dear Mom and Dad, things are intense here, but we're holding our own. Delta's been a lifesaver, literally. Yesterday, he detected an IED that could have taken out half our patrol. The guys have started calling him Guardian Angel. Our CO says he's the best dog in the entire theater. We're moving to a new position tomorrow. Can't say where, obviously, but it's supposed to be a bit quieter. Looking forward to that. Give my love to Mom. Tell her not to worry so much. Love, Robert." The date on the letter was 3 weeks before Michael's own unit had been ambushed in Kunar province. An ambush that had left him as the sole survivor, with a damaged knee, a traumatic brain injury, and a case of PTSD that had eventually driven him to the isolation of the Appalachian Mountains. The realization struck him with physical force, driving the air from his lungs. He knew Robert Hayes. Not well, they'd been in different companies. But he remembered the handler and his remarkable dog. They had been temporarily attached to Michael's unit for a specific operation, an operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. Michael sank into the desk chair, memories he'd spent months trying to suppress suddenly flooding back. The intelligence that had been faulty. The village that was supposed to be abandoned but wasn't. The firefight that erupted without warning. And through the case, a dog and his handler moving with incredible coordination, drawing fire away from the pinned-down soldiers. The last time Michael had seen Robert Hayes, the young handler had been directing Delta to lead a group of injured soldiers to safety while he provided covering fire. Michael, his knee shattered by a bullet, had been among those Delta guided away from the hot zone. He'd lost consciousness shortly after reaching the extraction point. When he woke up in a field hospital 3 days later, he was told he was the only survivor of the main patrol. He never knew what happened to the dog handler or his remarkable German shepherd. Until now. Michael returned to the living room, looking at William Hayes with new eyes. The elderly man slept on, unaware of the connection between them. Delta, however, watched Michael intently, as if aware of his revelation. "You remember me, don't you?" Michael whispered to the dog. "That's why you've been watching my cabin. You recognize me somehow." Delta's ears perked forward, his head tilting slightly. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Delta had survived the ambush, had been sent home to his handler's parents, and somehow, through some miracle of canine memory and loyalty, he had recognized Michael when he moved into the cabin 5 miles away, had been watching him, perhaps trying to understand why this man from his past was here, in his territory. And when the storm had threatened them both, Delta had fallen back on his training. Protect the unit, no matter what. A soft groan from the sofa pulled Michael from his thoughts. Hayes was waking, his face contorted with pain. "Mr. Hayes?" Michael moved quickly to his side. "What's wrong?" The elderly man pressed a hand to his chest, his breathing suddenly labored. "Pills," he gasped. "The small bottle, not the heart medication. The nitroglycerin." Michael rushed to find the medication. Hayes was having a heart attack, likely triggered by the stress and exposure of his ordeal. With shaking hands, Michael helped place a tiny pill under the elderly veteran's tongue. "Should I call an ambulance?" Michael asked, already knowing how long it would take emergency services to reach this remote location. Hayes shook his head slightly, eyes closed as he focused on his breathing. "Just wait," he managed. "See if it helps." Michael watched helplessly as Hayes fought his internal battle, Delta whining softly beside them. After what seemed an eternity, Hayes's breathing began to ease. The rigid tension in his body gradually relaxed. "Better," he whispered finally. "Not the first time. Won't be the last." Michael helped him sit up slightly, adjusting the pillows behind him. "You need a hospital, sir. That was a serious episode." Hayes waved a dismissive hand. "Had worse. Just need rest." His gaze shifted to Delta, then back to Michael. "You remembered, didn't you? About Robert?" Michael nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, I was there. In Kunar. Your son, he saved a lot of lives that day. Mine included." Tears welled in Hayes's faded blue eyes. "They told us he died covering the retreat, that he stayed behind so others could escape." A trembling hand reached for Delta's head. "They sent his dog home, said Delta was wounded too, but he'd recover, that he deserved to retire with family." Michael felt his own eyes burning. "Your son was a hero, sir. The bravest man I ever saw in action." Hayes studied Michael's face. "You've been carrying it, haven't you? The survivor's guilt. I can see it in your eyes. Same look Delta had when he first came home without Robert." The simple observation cut through Michael's defenses like they were tissue paper. The careful walls he'd built around his emotions began to crumble. His vision blurred with tears he'd refused to shed for years. "I don't remember everything," he admitted, voice cracking. "The doctor said the TBI affected my memory. There are gaps, but I remember your son and Delta. I remember them saving us, and I remember waking up and being told no one else made it." Hayes reached out a weathered hand, gripping Michael's forearm with surprising strength. "My son believed that every life was worth saving, even just one. He wouldn't want you hiding away up here, punishing yourself for surviving." The words struck Michael like a physical blow. He had been punishing himself for living when others died, for the fragments of memory he couldn't recover, for the sense that he had somehow failed his brothers in arms. "I don't know how to stop," Michael whispered. Hayes's grip tightened. "You start by accepting help when it's offered, just like you did with Delta during the storm." His eyes, suddenly clear and piercing, held Michael's gaze. "And you help others when you can, like you helped me today." As if understanding the gravity of the moment, Delta moved to place his head on Michael's knee, the damaged one that ached with the memory of that fateful day. The simple gesture of comfort from the animal who had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity broke something loose inside Michael. For the first time since returning home, Michael Foster wept openly for what he had lost, for what he had survived, and for the chance that might still exist for something more than mere existence. Outside, the last of the storm clouds parted, allowing shafts of sunlight to stream through the cabin windows. A new day was beginning, not just for the mountain forest, but for the wounded soldier who had finally found the first step on his long path home. The next few days fell into a strange, fragile routine. Michael refused to leave Hayes alone in his condition, especially after the heart episode. He made trips back to his own cabin only to collect supplies, always with Delta accompanying him like a gray shadow. Hayes's strength returned slowly. He was a tough old soldier, stubborn in his recovery, as he'd likely been throughout his life. By the third day, he was able to sit up for longer periods, even make his way to the bathroom with Michael's assistance. Their conversations were careful at first, circling around the edges of their shared history. They spoke of practical matters: the weather, Hayes's medication schedule, repairs needed around the cabin. Both men seemed to understand the need to build trust before delving into deeper waters. It was on the fourth evening, as they sat before the fire with mugs of coffee, that Hayes finally broached the subject. "You said you had gaps in your memory," he said, his voice stronger now, "about that day in Kunar." Michael tensed, his hand tightening around his mug. "Yes, sir. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia from the trauma, common with TBI and PTSD. Hayes nodded slowly. "Would you like to know more about what happened to Robert?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with importance. Part of Michael wanted to refuse, to preserve the protective fog that surrounded that day. But a deeper part, the part that had begun to heal since finding Delta, needed to know. "Yes," he said finally, "I would." Hayes set down his coffee and reached for a wooden box on the side table. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing a folded letter with official military letterhead. "This came with Robert's personal effects," he explained. "It's from his commanding officer. He wrote it personally, not just the standard condolence letter." Michael accepted the paper with reverence, unfolding it carefully. The letter detailed the events of that day from a perspective he'd never heard. How Robert Hayes had volunteered to join the patrol because of Delta's superior IED detection abilities. How he had fought with exceptional courage when the ambush began, and how, in the final moments, he had made the decision to stay behind, creating a diversion that allowed the wounded, including Michael, to escape. "He sent Delta with you," Hayes said quietly as Michael finished reading. The CO wrote that Robert's last order to his dog was to lead the wounded to safety. Delta was shot in the process, took a bullet in his shoulder, but he kept going. Got you all to the extraction point before collapsing himself. Michael closed his eyes, the fragmented images in his memory suddenly connecting. He remembered now. Delta pulling at his sleeve as he tried to crawl with his shattered knee. The dog guiding him around obstacles. Staying by his side even as gunfire continued in the distance. "I owe him my life," Michael said, his voice raw. "Both of them." Hayes's eyes were distant, looking at something beyond the cabin walls. "When Delta came home to us, he was different. Quieter. Would spend hours just staring at the door, waiting for Robert to walk through it." The old man smiled sadly. "He'd disappear sometimes. We'd find him on this ridge about half a mile from here. Just sitting, watching. Margaret called it his sentry post." "The flat rock," Michael said, the connection forming. "That's where I'd see him every day. Same time." Hayes nodded. "That spot, it was special to us. Margaret and I built this cabin 40 years ago. That ridge was where we'd watch the sunset. After she passed 5 years back, Robert and I would take Delta up there whenever he was home on leave." His voice caught. "Last time we were all there together was the night before Robert deployed for his final tour. The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. Delta hadn't been randomly patrolling. He'd been maintaining a vigil, honoring both his handler and the place that held memories of their family. "When did you move into your cabin?" Hayes asked suddenly. Michael thought back. "About 11 months ago, right after I was discharged." "And when did Delta start watching you?" "Pretty much right away. I noticed him within the first week." Hayes leaned forward, his expression intense. "You know what that means, don't you? Delta recognized you. After all this time, he knew you were one of the men Robert saved." The thought was almost too much to bear. That this animal, this remarkable creature, had carried the memory of that terrible day for years, had somehow connected Michael to it, and had appointed himself guardian over the survivor of his handler's final act of heroism. "Is that why you were out in the storm?" Michael asked. "Looking for Delta?" Hayes's expression clouded with shame. "I was worried. He hadn't come home the night before. Never stays away that long. I thought maybe he'd finally gotten too old, gotten confused somewhere in the woods." He shook his head. "Should have known better." "He was with you, wasn't he?" "Yes," Michael confirmed. "He saved me when a tree fell, got me back to my cabin." Hayes nodded, a proud smile touching his lips. "Always on duty, that one." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Delta was instantly alert, moving to stand between the door and the two men, his posture tense but not aggressive. Michael rose, hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm he'd kept within reach. "Were you expecting anyone?" Hayes shook his head. "Not out here." Approaching the door cautiously, Michael peered through the small window. A woman in a forest ranger uniform stood on the porch, her expression worried. He relaxed slightly and opened the door, though not fully. "Can I help you?" he asked. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, I wasn't expecting—" "I'm Claire Thompson, Forestry Service. We've been searching for William Hayes. Is he here? Is he all right?" "He's here," Michael confirmed. "He had a fall during the storm, but he's recovering." The relief on Claire's face was palpable. "Thank God, we've had search parties out for days. The storm made it nearly impossible." She peered past Michael. "May I come in? I should check on him." Michael hesitated, his instinct for privacy warring with the knowledge that Hayes probably needed proper medical attention. Before he could decide, Hayes's voice called from within. "Let her in, Michael. Claire's a friend." Michael stepped aside, allowing the ranger to enter. Delta remained vigilant, but relaxed slightly when Hayes greeted the woman warmly. "William Hayes," Claire scolded, kneeling beside the sofa. "You've had half the county worried sick. What were you thinking, going out in that weather?" "Wasn't thinking," Hayes admitted. "Just worried about my dog." As Claire checked Hayes's vital signs and examined the gash on his forehead, Michael watched from a distance, suddenly feeling like an intruder. This was Hayes's world, a place where people knew each other, where a missing elderly man prompted community concern. It was everything Michael had been avoiding since his return from overseas. "He needs to see a doctor," Claire said finally, turning to Michael. "That heart episode you described concerns me, and this cut should have had stitches." "I'm fine," Hayes protested weakly. Claire ignored him, focusing on Michael. "I've got a vehicle that can make it up here. We could take him to the clinic in town." The prospect of town, of people, questions, noise made Michael's chest tighten. But one look at Hayes, dull and exhausted despite his protests, made the decision clear. "Let me get a few things together for him," Michael said. As he collected Hayes's medications and packed a small bag, Michael could hear Claire and Hayes talking in low voices. He caught fragments: his name, questions about who he was, Hayes's abbreviated explanation of their connection. When he returned to the living room, Claire was looking at him with new interest. "Mr. Hayes tells me you're staying in the old Miller cabin," she said. "That you're a veteran too." Michael nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just temporarily." Claire seemed to sense his discomfort and didn't press. "Well, we should get going if we want to make it to the clinic before they close. Will you be coming with us?" The question caught Michael off guard. The logical part of him knew he should go. Hayes might need an advocate, and there were likely forms to fill out, questions to answer. But the part of him that had sought isolation for nearly a year rebelled at the thought. Before he could respond, Delta moved to stand beside him, pressing against his leg in a gesture that was unmistakably supportive. The dog looked up at him, then at Hayes, Then back at him. A clear message. Hayes seemed to understand what was happening. "Michael," he said gently, "I'd feel better if you came along, just to make sure they don't try to admit me unnecessarily. You know how doctors can be with old folks." It was a transparent attempt to give Michael a mission, a purpose that would override his anxiety, and surprisingly, it worked. "All right," Michael agreed. "But what about Delta?" "He can come too," Claire said. "I've got a crate in the back of my SUV. We use it when we find injured wildlife." The journey down the mountain was tense for Michael. Sitting in the back seat of Claire's forestry service vehicle, with Delta in his crate beside him, he watched the wilderness give way to scattered homes, then to the outskirts of Piney Ridge. It was hardly a metropolis, population 2,300 according to the welcome sign, but after months of seeing no one but himself, it might as well have been New York City. His anxiety climbed as they pulled into the small medical clinic's parking lot. People were coming and going, cars, voices, normalcy that now felt alien and threatening. "You okay back there?" Claire asked, catching his expression in the rearview mirror. "Fine," Michael replied automatically, even as his heart raced. Hayes turned slightly in his seat, his faded blue eyes meeting Michael's. "One step at a time, son, just like on patrol." The simple advice, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who understood, steadied Michael. He took a deep breath and nodded, one step at a time. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Michael woke on Hayes's worn armchair, his stiff body protesting the awkward sleeping position. His knee throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, the price of yesterday's rescue. But the pain felt different somehow, purposeful rather than merely punishing. Hayes was still asleep on the sofa, his breathing steady, his color much improved. Delta lay on the floor between them, head resting on paws, eyes opening immediately when Michael stirred. "Morning," Michael said softly to the dog. "How's he doing?" Delta rose and stretched, then moved to Hayes's side, gently nosing the old man's hand. Hayes's eyes fluttered open, confusion momentarily clouding his features before recognition set in. "You're still here," he said, voice stronger than the day before. "Said I would be," Michael replied, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" Hayes pushed himself to a sitting position, moving with the deliberate caution of a man well acquainted with his body's limitations. "Better than I've got any right to be, thanks to you and this old soldier here." He patted Delta's head. "Thought I might be meeting Margaret yesterday." Michael stood and moved to the kitchen. "Think you can manage some breakfast? Found some oatmeal in the cupboard." Hayes nodded and Michael set about preparing a simple meal. As the water boiled, he glanced out the window at the transformed landscape. The storm had passed, but its effects remained. Fallen branches, small streams where none had been before, the forest floor carpeted with wet, glistening leaves. "You know," Hayes called from the sofa, "I've been thinking about what you said, about Robert in that day." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "There's something I need to show you, in my desk. Top drawer. There's a manila envelope marked Kunar after action." Michael moved to the study, finding the envelope exactly where Hayes had described. His hands trembled slightly as he returned to the living room and handed it to the older man. Hayes took it, but didn't open it. Instead, he looked at Michael with piercing clarity. "After we lost Robert, I couldn't make sense of it. 30 years in the military, and I couldn't understand how my own son could be gone. So I started asking questions, used some old connections, called in favors." He tapped the envelope. "This is what I got, the official report, and then some notes from a buddy at the Pentagon. Things that didn't make the official channels." Michael's mouth went dry. "Sir, You don't remember everything," Hayes interrupted gently. "But I know things you don't. About what happened after you were evacuated. About who was responsible for the bad intel. About what my son did in those final minutes." He held out the envelope. "I think you need to see this more than I do now." Michael accepted the envelope, feeling its weight, both physical and metaphorical, in his hands. He opened it carefully, pulling out a stack of papers. The top document was instantly recognizable, a standard after-action report, heavily redacted. But beneath it were handwritten notes, a map with positions marked in red pen, and most surprisingly, a letter on Pentagon letterhead. As Michael began to read, the fragmented puzzle of his memories started to rearrange itself. The operation had been compromised from the start, not by faulty intelligence, but by deliberate misinformation. A high-level Afghan official, supposedly an ally, had fed them false information about the village being abandoned. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated trap. Robert Hayes and Delta had been the first to realize something was wrong. They had detected signs of recent occupation that contradicted their briefing. Robert had radioed this information back, but by then it was too late. They were already surrounded. What followed was chaos, exactly as Michael remembered. But what he hadn't known, what he couldn't have known, was that Robert Hayes hadn't simply sacrificed himself in a desperate last stand. He had discovered the location of a hidden tunnel system, and he had sent Delta to lead the wounded soldiers, including Michael, to this escape route while he provided covering fire. Delta had gotten the survivors to the tunnel entrance, but Michael, delirious from blood loss and pain, had lost consciousness before entering. Delta had then returned to his handler, loyal to the end. Together they had held off the attacking forces long enough for the other survivors to escape through the tunnel. But then came the most shocking revelation. According to the handwritten notes, there had been radio contact with Robert nearly an hour after Michael and the others had been evacuated. He had reported that he and Delta were pinned down but still fighting. He had requested air support, but by the time it arrived, the position had been overrun. Delta had been found the next day, wounded but alive, hiding in the ruins of a building near where Robert had made his last stand. There was no mention of how the dog had survived or what had happened in those final moments. Michael looked up from the papers, his mind reeling. He was alive after we got out. He was still alive. Hayes nodded, his eyes glistening. For almost an hour, fighting to the last breath. They gave him the Silver Star posthumously. Should have been the Medal of Honor, if you ask me. Michael carefully returned the papers to the envelope, his hands shaking. I was told no one else made it, that I was the only survivor. 6 men made it out through that tunnel, Hayes said quietly, all because of my son and his dog. But you were the only one from your original squad. The others were from the support element. Michael's gaze fell on Delta, who watched him with those intelligent amber eyes. And Delta came home to you. Wounded in 3 places, Hayes confirmed. Took months to recover physically. But the real wounds were deeper. He would just sit and stare at the door, waiting for Robert to walk through it. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't play. The Army sent a handler to help with his transition, but Delta wasn't having it. Hayes reached down to stroke the dog's head. Then one day, about 2 months after he came to live with us, he just got up and walked out the door. Started doing his patrol, like he's been doing ever since. Every day, same route, same time. Margaret said he was looking for Robert. I think she was right, in a way. Michael thought about the daily vigil Delta had kept at the edge of his property. And then I moved in. Must have recognized your scent, Hayes said. Or something about you. Dogs like Delta, they don't forget. Especially not someone they saved. The realization hit Michael with stunning clarity. He wasn't just watching me, he was checking on me, making sure I was okay. Hayes smiled softly. Robert always said Delta took his job seriously. Guess he never stopped being on duty. The older man's voice grew serious. Now about that heart attack yesterday. You need a hospital, Michael interjected firmly. I've been thinking about it all night. We need to get you checked out properly. Hayes shook his head. Been having these episodes for years. Doctor says it's just a matter of time, but I'll be damned if I spend my last days in some sterile hospital room. Margaret died in our bed, right here in this cabin. That's how I want to go too, when my time comes. Michael recognized the stubborn determination in the old veteran's eyes. The same unyielding resolve he'd seen in soldiers who had made up their minds about something. Consequences be damned. At least let me call someone, Michael insisted. A doctor who can come check on you. This was a serious episode, sir. Hayes considered this for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. There's a doctor in town, Thomas Kennedy. Known him 40 years, his number's by the phone. He paused, studying Michael. But that means you'll have to go into town. Think you can handle that? The question wasn't just about the physical journey. It was about Michael confronting the world he'd been hiding from for nearly a year. I'll manage, Michael said, though his stomach tightened at the thought. Hayes nodded, satisfied. While you're there, might as well pick up some supplies. I'll make a list. The simple domestic task felt strangely normal, a sharp contrast to the emotional weight of their earlier conversation. Michael finished making breakfast, and they ate in comfortable silence, Delta watching hopefully for any dropped morsels. After breakfast, Michael helped Hayes to his bedroom, where the old man could rest more comfortably. As he was settling in, Hayes gestured to the closet. Robert's old clothes are in there, he said. You look about his size. Might find something better than those mudcake things you're wearing. The offer caught Michael off guard. Wearing a dead man's clothes, not just any dead man, but one whose sacrifice had saved his life, felt uncomfortably intimate. But his own clothes were indeed still damp and filthy from yesterday's ordeal. Thank you, he said simply. Hayes waved a hand dismissively. He'd want them used, not gathering dust. His eyes grew distant. Margaret could never bring herself to pack them away. Said as long as his things were here, part of him was still home. Michael nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. He'd kept his own father's watch long after it had stopped working, unable to part with that last tangible connection. Once Hayes was settled, Michael returned to the living room where Delta waited patiently by the door. Need to go out, boy? The dog wagged his tail once, a dignified, measured response. Michael opened the door and Delta trotted outside, immediately assuming a patrol posture as he surveyed the property. Michael watched from the porch, struck by how the animal's military training had become so ingrained, so much a part of his nature, that even years later, he maintained his discipline. While Delta patrolled, Michael retrieved a change of clothes from Robert's closet. The simple act of opening the door released a faint scent, cologne perhaps, or just the lingering essence of the man who had once worn these garments. Michael selected a pair of jeans, a flannel shirt, and a sturdy canvas jacket, all of which fit reasonably well. Dressed in clean, dry clothes, with Hayes resting comfortably and Delta on guard outside, Michael sat at the kitchen table and studied the map he'd found in Hayes' study. The nearest town, Piney Ridge, was about 7 miles away, a considerable distance on foot, especially with his bad knee. He was contemplating this problem when he heard a vehicle approaching. Delta's warning bark from outside confirmed that they had a visitor. Michael moved to the window, instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. A forest green truck with U.S. Forest Service emblazoned on the door was pulling up to the cabin. A woman in a ranger's uniform stepped out, glancing warily at Delta, who stood at attention, watching her every move. Michael stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" The ranger looked up, surprise crossing her features. "Oh, I was expecting to find Bill Hayes. I'm Claire Thompson, Forest Service. We've been looking for him since the storm hit." "He's inside," Michael said. "Had a bit of trouble in the storm, but he's resting now." Relief washed over Claire's face. "Thank God, we've had search parties out for 2 days." She eyed Delta, who maintained his vigilant stance. "I see Delta's okay too. That's good." "You know them?" Michael asked. Claire nodded. "Everyone around here knows Bill and Delta. Bill's something of a local legend. Fought in Korea, raised a war hero's son, serves on the town council despite living all the way out here." She studied Michael curiously. "I don't think we've met, though." "Michael Foster," he said, descending the porch steps. "I live a few miles east of here. Delta found me during the storm, led me to Hayes yesterday." Claire's eyes widened. "You're the one who bought the old Wilson place. Been wondering who moved in up there." She extended her hand. "Proper introduction, then." "Claire Thompson. I oversee this section of the National Forest." Michael hesitated briefly before accepting the handshake. Human contact, even something as simple as this, had become unfamiliar during his months of isolation. "I was actually about to head into town," he said. "Hayes had a heart episode yesterday, needs a doctor to check on him, but he refuses to go to the hospital." Claire rolled her eyes. "Stubborn old goat. Let me guess, he wants Tom Kennedy?" Michael nodded, surprised. "Tom's his poker buddy. Only Dr. Bill trusts." She gestured to her truck. "I can give you a ride, save you the hike. And I've got a radio to call ahead. Let Tom know what's happening." The offer was exactly what Michael needed, yet he found himself hesitating. The prospect of close quarters with a stranger, of conversation, of navigating social niceties he'd all but forgotten, it made his palms sweat. But Hayes needed medicine, needed a doctor. and Michael had promised to help. That would be appreciated, he managed. Claire smiled, seemingly unaware of his internal struggle. Great, let me just check on Bill first, then we can head out. She looked at Delta. Will he let me pass? Delta, Michael called, the command in his voice automatic. Friend. The German shepherd's posture relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on Claire. He knows me, Claire assured Michael. We just have a professional understanding. He guards. I respect his territory. She approached the porch carefully, and Delta allowed her to pass, though he followed close behind as she entered the cabin. Michael remained outside, taking deep breaths of the cool morning air. The interaction with Claire had been brief but exhausting, a reminder of how far he had withdrawn from normal human contact. Yet there had also been something unexpectedly manageable about it. Perhaps it was because Claire herself seemed straightforward, practical, the kind of person who didn't demand social performances or empty pleasantries. Or perhaps it was simply that Michael now had a purpose that outweighed his discomfort, helping the father of the man who had saved his life. Either way, he was about to venture into town for the first time in nearly a year. The thought filled him with dread, but also with a strange, tentative sense of possibility, like a patrol moving into unknown territory. Dangerous, yes, but also necessary. Delta emerged from the cabin and came to sit beside him, a solid, reassuring presence. Michael reached down to touch the dog's head, drawing strength from the animal's unwavering composure. Guess we're both stepping outside our patrol routes today, he murmured. Delta looked up at him, amber eyes reflecting a wisdom and understanding that transcended species. In that moment, Michael felt a profound connection to this fellow warrior. Both of them scarred by the same battle, both still carrying out their duties in their own ways, both loyal to the memory of a man who had exemplified the highest ideals of sacrifice and courage. Claire reappeared on the porch. Bill's doing better than I expected, but Tom should definitely take a look. You ready to head into town? Michael straightened, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for a mission. Ready. He turned to Delta, who watched him expectantly. Stay, he said firmly. Guard. The German shepherd settled into a sentinel position on the porch, his posture making it clear that no harm would come to William Hayes while he stood watch. As Michael climbed into Claire's truck, he cast one last glance at the cabin, at the unexpected convergence of past and present, of guilt and redemption, of wounds and healing. For the first time in a very long time, he was moving towards something, not just away. The engine started and they began the journey down the mountain, leaving Delta standing guard, a silent, faithful sentinel watching over them all. The Forest Service truck wound its way down the mountain road, each curve revealing glimpses of the valley below. Michael gripped the door handle, his knuckles white, as the outside world rushed toward him. 7 miles suddenly felt like crossing an ocean. So, Claire said, breaking the silence, you've been up at the Wilson place for what, almost a year? Michael nodded, not taking his eyes off the road. 11 months. Don't think anyone's seen you in town, she observed. Must have quite the stockpile. I plan ahead, he replied simply. Claire seemed to sense his discomfort. She drove in silence for a while, expertly navigating the rain-damaged road. Fallen branches had been pushed aside, evidence of earlier rescue vehicles making their way up the mountain. We had 3 teams out looking for Bill, she said eventually. Found his truck parked at the trailhead, but the storm made tracking impossible. The dog saved his life, finding you. Delta, Michael corrected automatically. His name's Delta. Claire glanced at him. You're good with him. Military working dog experience? The direct question caught Michael off guard. How did you... The way you handle him, the commands, plus the way you stand, the way you scan the road ahead. She shrugged. My brother was Army. 2 tours in Iraq. I recognize the signs. Michael relaxed slightly. Afghanistan, 3 tours. Thought so. She didn't press further, and Michael felt oddly grateful for her restraint. As they descended into the valley, the forest gave way to scattered farms, then to clusters of houses. Piney Ridge emerged ahead, a small town nestled at the base of the mountains. From a distance, it looked like a postcard image of rural America. A church steeple, a main street lined with brick buildings, American flags fluttering from porches. Michael's heart rate quickened. Too many people, too many variables, too many places where things could go wrong. You okay? Claire asked, noticing his tension. Fine, he said automatically. She slowed the truck. Listen, I can tell this isn't easy for you. How about I drop you at Doc Kennedy's office, then pick up whatever supplies Bill needs? That way you don't have to deal with the whole town at once. The offer was perceptive and kind. Michael found himself nodding. That would help. No problem. Bill left a standing tab at Morton's General Store. I'll just put whatever he needs on his account. A few minutes later, they pulled up in front of a small white building with a simple sign, Thomas Kennedy, MD. It stood slightly apart from the main cluster of businesses, with a garden surrounding it rather than a parking lot, more home than medical facility. I radioed ahead, so Tom's expecting you, Claire said. I'll head over to Morton's and meet you back here in about 30 minutes. That work? Yes, thank you. Michael hesitated, then added, for understanding. Claire's smile was warm but not pitying. Like I said, my brother. She left the thought unfinished, but the meaning was clear. She understood because she'd seen it before. As Claire drove away, Michael approached the doctor's office. Before he could knock, the door swung open to reveal a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and glasses perched on his nose. You must be Michael, he said, extending his hand. Tom Kennedy. I understand our mutual friend Bill Hayes had another episode. Michael shook the offered hand briefly. Yes, sir. Yesterday afternoon. Nitroglycerin seemed to help, but knowing Bill, he refused to come in. Kennedy sighed. Stubborn as they come, always has been, even before Margaret passed. Come on in. Tell me exactly what happened. The interior of Kennedy's office was more living room than clinic. Comfortable chairs, bookshelves, a desk that looked like an antique. Only a small examination area behind a partial screen betrayed its medical purpose. Michael described Hayes' condition, the heart attack symptoms, the medications he'd taken. Kennedy listened carefully, occasionally making notes. Sounds like angina, consistent with his existing condition, Kennedy said when Michael finished. I've been telling him for years he needs a pacemaker, but, he shrugged. How's his breathing now? Any swelling in the ankles? Breathing seemed normal this morning. Didn't notice any swelling. Kennedy nodded. That's good. Look, I'll pack up some medication and come out to see him tomorrow morning. Would have gone today, but I've got Mrs. Halverson in labor with twins. He paused, studying Michael. You staying with him? Michael hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been focused on getting Hayes help, not on what came after. But the answer seemed obvious. Yes, for now. Good. Bill shouldn't be alone, not after an episode like that. Kennedy moved to a medicine cabinet and began selecting bottles. I'm giving you a stronger nitroglycerin prescription, plus a few other things that might help. Instructions are on the labels, but call me if anything changes. Anything at all. As Kennedy prepared the medications, Michael found himself drawn to a wall of photographs. Most showed the doctor with patients of various ages, but one stood out. A group of young men in desert camouflage, arms slung around each other's shoulders, standing before a medical tent. My son James in his unit, Kennedy said, noticing Michael's interest. He's an Army doctor. Just finished his second tour in Afghanistan last year. Michael studied the photo more closely. The insignia on their uniforms was familiar. The same division he had served with, though a different regiment. Good men, Michael said quietly. The best, Kennedy agreed. He handed Michael a bag of medications. These should help Bill until I can get out there. And this, he held out a business card with a handwritten number on the back, is my personal cell. Day or night you call if his condition changes. Michael accepted both, tucking them carefully into Robert Hayes' jacket pocket. The responsibility felt enormous but necessary. A mission as clear and vital as any he'd undertaken in combat. Thank you, Doctor. Tom, Kennedy corrected. Everyone around here calls me Tom. He paused. You know, it's good Bill has someone checking on him. Since Robert died and then Margaret passed last year, he's been too alone out there. Just him and that dog. The mention of Margaret caught Michael's attention. Hayes said she died 3 years ago. Kennedy frowned. No, it was last spring, April 16th. Heart failure, just like Bill's fighting now. It hit him hard. They'd been married 57 years. He shook his head. Time gets a bit slippery for Bill these days. Part of the reason I worry about him up there alone. This new information shifted Michael's understanding of Hayes' situation. The old man wasn't just grieving his son, he was also dealing with the recent loss of his wife, and his grip on reality might be less firm than Michael had assumed. "I'll keep an eye on him," Michael promised. "Good man." Kennedy glanced at his watch. "I'd better prep for those twins. Tell Bill y'all see him tomorrow, and for God's sake, try to make him take his medication on schedule." Michael left the doctor's office with a clearer sense of Hayes' medical needs, but also with new concerns about the old man's mental state. If Hayes was confused about when his wife died, what else might he be confused about? Claire was waiting outside in the Forest Service truck, the bed now filled with supplies, groceries, a propane tank, tools, and what looked like building materials. "Got everything on Bill's regular order plus some extras," she explained as Michael climbed in. "Figure you might need supplies too, since you're staying out there." Michael was surprised by her assumption. "How did you know I'd stay?" Claire gave him a knowing look. "You military types stick together. Besides, you wouldn't have gone to all this trouble just to abandon him now." She was right, of course. The thought of leaving Hayes hadn't even occurred to him. Not just because of his connection to Robert, but because the old man clearly needed help. And for the first time in a long time, Michael was in a position to provide it. They drove back through town, and Michael forced himself to look more carefully at his surroundings. Piney Ridge was smaller than he'd initially thought, maybe 2,000 residents at most. The main street hosted the essentials: a general store, a diner, a hardware store, a small bank, and a post office. American flags flew from many buildings, and autumn decorations adorned shop windows. It was the America he had fought for, the small-town heartland that had always represented home in his mind, even when he was thousands of miles away in desert landscapes. Yet now it felt almost as foreign as Afghanistan had when he first arrived there. "Your place is pretty close to Bill's, right?" Claire asked as they began the ascent back into the mountains. "About 5 miles east." "Ever notice anything strange up there? Lights in the forest at night? Unusual sounds?" The question seemed oddly specific. "No, why?" Claire hesitated. "Probably nothing. We've had reports from hikers about strange lights near the old mining area, about halfway between your places. Thought maybe you'd seen something." "Haven't noticed anything," Michael said, "but I haven't exactly been exploring." "Fair enough." Claire changed the subject. "So what's your plan for Bill? Dr. Kennedy coming out?" "Tomorrow morning. Until then, I'll stay with him, make sure he takes his medication." Claire nodded approvingly. "Good. I've been worried about him since Margaret died. That hit him hard, right after losing Robert." "Kennedy mentioned Margaret died last spring," Michael said carefully, "but Hayes told me it was 3 years ago." Claire's expression grew concerned. "Yeah, that's been happening more often lately. Bill gets confused about time. Sometimes he talks about Margaret like she just stepped out to the garden. Other times he seems to know she's gone." She sighed. "The folks at church have been trying to convince him to move into town, maybe into assisted living, but he's stubborn," Michael finished. "Exactly. Wants to die in that cabin, just like Margaret did." They drove in silence for a while, the truck climbing steadily up the mountain road. Michael processed this new information. Hayes' confusion about time explained some things, but raised new questions about other details he had shared, particularly regarding Robert and the events in Afghanistan. "Did you know Robert?" Michael asked suddenly. Claire's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Everyone in Piney Ridge knew Robert. He was the local hero, star quarterback, Eagle Scout, joined the Army right after 9/11. Her voice softened. "I was a few years behind him in school, but yeah, I knew him. Hard not to, in a town this size." "Hayes showed me some papers about how Robert died," Michael said carefully. "In Kunar province." Claire glanced at him sharply. "Bill showed you those? He doesn't share those with anyone, not even the guys from his VFW post." Michael nodded. "He thought I should see them, because I was there." The truck slowed as Claire processed this. "You were there? When Robert died?" "My unit was involved in the same operation. I was wounded, evacuated early. Didn't know what happened to everyone else until later." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was as much as Michael could bring himself to share. Claire pulled the truck to the side of the road and stopped, turning to face him fully. "Is that why you moved up here? Because of what happened to Robert? No, Michael said truthfully. I had no idea Robert Hayes was from here. No idea his father lived nearby. It was just a coincidence. Claire studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. That's one hell of a coincidence. Life is full of them, Michael replied, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. She seemed to accept this, putting the truck back in gear. Well, coincidence or not, maybe it's good you're here. For Bill, I mean. Having someone who was there, who knew Robert at the end. She trailed off, then added quietly, it might help him find some peace. The rest of the journey passed in thoughtful silence. When they reached Hayes's cabin, Delta was exactly where Michael had left him, standing guard on the porch. The dog's posture relaxed slightly when he recognized the truck, but he remained alert. I'll help unload, Michael said as Claire parked. Together, they carried the supplies into the cabin. Hayes was awake, sitting in an armchair by the window, looking stronger than he had that morning. Well, well, he said, eyeing the pile of groceries. Looks like you raided the whole store, Claire. Just the usual, plus some extras, she replied with an easy familiarity. How are you feeling, Bill? Right as rain, Hayes declared, though the pallor of his skin contradicted his words. No need for all this fuss. Doc Kennedy's coming out tomorrow, Michael informed him, placing the bag of medications on the table. He sent these for now, with strict instructions about taking them on schedule. Hayes waved a dismissive hand. Tom worries too much, always has. He worries the right amount, Claire countered, arranging the groceries in the kitchen with practiced efficiency. And he asked me to remind you that you promised to play poker on Thursday, so you'd better be alive for it. This drew a genuine laugh from Hayes. Can't miss poker night. Only chance I get to take that old sawbones money. The easy banter between Hayes and Claire revealed a deep-rooted friendship, the kind built over many years in a small community. Michael found himself envying that connection, that sense of belonging somewhere. Once everything was unloaded, Claire prepared to leave. I've got to get back to the station, file my report, but I'll check in tomorrow after Tom's been by. She looked at Michael. You good here? Michael nodded. We'll be fine. Thanks for finding him, she said, her gaze encompassing both Michael and Delta. Not everyone would have gone out in that storm. After Claire left, Michael helped Hayes take his medication, then prepared a simple lunch from the supplies she had brought. As they ate, Hayes watched him with a shrewd expression. So, the old man said finally, you met our Claire. She was helpful, Michael replied neutrally. She's a good one, Hayes nodded. Grew up next door to us. Robert taught her how to fish. She used to follow him around like a puppy. A fond smile crossed his face. Always thought those two might end up together someday, if things had been different. Michael remembered the way Claire's hands had tightened on the steering wheel when he mentioned Robert. Perhaps Hayes wasn't entirely wrong about their relationship. She said you've been confused about time lately, Michael said, deciding directness was the best approach. About when Margaret died. Hayes's smile faded. He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his half-eaten sandwich. Sometimes, he admitted finally, I wake up and forget she's gone. Reach across the bed expecting to find her there. He looked up, his eyes suddenly clear and lucid. But I know she died last spring, April 16th. Sometimes it's easier to think it was longer ago. Makes the pain less fresh. The simple honesty of this confession caught Michael off guard. He had expected defensiveness or denial, not this vulnerable acknowledgement. I understand, he said quietly. Sometimes the mind protects itself. Hayes studied him with those piercing blue eyes. That what you've been doing up in that cabin of yours? Protecting yourself? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Maybe, Michael conceded. How's that working out for you? Michael considered the question seriously. It was working fine until Delta showed up. Hayes chuckled. Dogs have a way of complicating things, especially this one. He reached down to scratch Delta's ears, the dog leaning into his touch. But I suspect he's done you a favor, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. After lunch, Hayes needed to rest. Michael helped him to bed, then returned to the living room where Delta waited by the door, clearly ready for his afternoon patrol. All right, boy, Michael said, opening the door. Show me the perimeter. Delta led him on a precise circuit of the property, first the immediate area around the cabin, then a wider loop that encompassed the small garden, a tool shed, and a workshop behind the house. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to investigate a scent or sound before continuing. Michael realized this wasn't just a random patrol. It was a carefully planned security route, the kind a military working dog would follow in a forward operating base. Delta was still doing his job, protecting his home and his remaining human. The workshop behind the cabin caught Michael's attention. Unlike the somewhat neglected garden, the workshop was immaculately maintained. Tools hanging in precise order on pegboards, workbenches clean and organized, projects in various stages of completion arranged neatly. Most striking were the wooden toys lined up on a shelf, intricately carved animals, trucks, trains, and puzzles, each crafted with extraordinary skill and attention to detail. Michael picked up a small wooden horse, marveling at the flowing mane and the subtle musculature captured in the grain of the wood. "Robert's workshop," Hayes said from the doorway, startling Michael. The old man had followed them outside, moving slowly but steadily. He always had a gift for working with his hands. "These are incredible," Michael said, carefully replacing the horse. "He made all these?" Hayes nodded, moving into the space with obvious pride. "Started when he was 12. I taught him the basics, but he surpassed me quickly." He ran a hand over a half-finished rocking horse. He was working on this before his last deployment. Said he'd finish it when he got back. The old man's voice caught slightly. For the children he hoped to have someday. Michael looked around the workshop with new eyes, seeing not just the craftsmanship, but the dreams represented in each piece. The future Robert Hayes had planned, but would never realize. "I come out here sometimes," Hayes continued, "try to work on his projects, but my hands aren't what they used to be." He held them up, showing the slight tremor that affected his fingers. "Can't get the details right anymore." Michael approached the rocking horse, examining the unfinished work. The body was complete, beautifully shaped and sanded, but the head was only roughed out, the mane not yet carved, the rockers attached but unfinished. "I used to do some woodworking," Michael said. "Nothing this fine, but I could help you finish it if you wanted." Hayes looked at him with surprise. "You'd do that?" "Least I could do," Michael replied honestly. A slow smile spread across Hayes's weathered face. "Robert would like that. He always said things should be finished properly, not left half done." As they stood in the workshop, surrounded by the tangible remnants of Robert Hayes's creativity and skill, Michael felt a strange sense of rightness, as if the scattered pieces of his shattered life were beginning to form a new pattern. Not the same as before, but something with its own purpose and meaning. Delta watched from the doorway, his intelligent eyes moving between the two men. The dog's presence seemed to bridge past and present, connecting them through a shared history of service, sacrifice, and now, perhaps, healing. Hayes moved to a workbench and opened a drawer, pulling out a worn leather pouch. "Robert's carving tools," he said, offering them to Michael. "Best Swedish steel. He'd want them used." Michael accepted the pouch with the reverence it deserved. "I'll be careful with them." "I know you will," Hayes said simply. Then with a slight smile, he added, "We can start tomorrow after Tom's visit. Give us both something to focus on besides my ticker." As they walked back to the cabin, Michael with the leather tool pouch in hand and Delta following close behind, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the clearing. For the first time and longer than he could remember, Michael Foster felt something taking root inside him that he had thought was gone forever: hope. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the mountain air carrying the first real bite of autumn. Michael rose early, his body still tuned to military time despite months of civilian life. He found Hayes already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Delta lying at his feet. "Morning," Hayes greeted him. "Coffee's fresh." Michael poured himself a cup, noting that Hayes looked stronger today, his color better, his movements more sure. "You're up early." "Old habits," Hayes replied with a shrug. "Never could sleep past 5, even after retirement." He gestured to the window where the eastern sky was painted in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Besides, hate to miss this. Margaret always said God puts on his best show at dawn when fewer people are watching." Michael took a seat across from Hayes, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Dr. Kennedy should be here around 9. Tom will say I'm fine, Hayes predicted. Been having these episodes for years. Heart's like an old engine. Sputters sometimes, but keeps on running. Michael wasn't so sure, but he didn't argue. Instead, he changed the subject. After he leaves, I thought we might work on that rocking horse. Hayes's eyes brightened. I'd like that. Been too long since that workshop saw any real use. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise through the window. Michael found himself studying Hayes's face, the deep lines etched by time and grief, the clear blue eyes that carried both weariness and resolve. He saw echoes of Robert in the old man's features, the same determined set of the jaw, the same watchful intelligence. Tell me about him, Michael said suddenly. About Robert, not the soldier, the man. Hayes seemed surprised by the request, but not displeased. He set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair, his gaze growing distant. Robert was steady, even as a boy, the kind who thought before he spoke, who fixed things instead of breaking them. A smile touched his lips. Had a mind like a steel trap, remembered everything he read. Could have gone to any college on scholarship, but he wanted to serve, said it was his duty. Hayes's voice grew softer, more reflective. He loved this mountain, knew every trail, every stream, could name all the birds by their songs alone. He gestured toward the workshop, spent hours out there, turning pieces of wood into something beautiful. Said he could see what was hiding inside the grain, just waiting to be set free. Michael listened intently, trying to reconcile this portrait of a thoughtful craftsman with the focused military dog handler he had briefly known in Afghanistan. Both versions were true, he realized, different facets of the same remarkable person. After 9/11, he didn't hesitate, Hayes continued, signed up the next day, said if he didn't go, someone else's son would have to. The old man's eyes glistened. He was like that, always thinking about what he could do so others wouldn't have to carry the burden. Michael felt a tightness in his throat. It was the same selfless instinct that had led Robert Hayes to stay behind, covering the retreat of his wounded comrades. He would have made a fine father, Hayes added quietly. That's what I regret the most, that he never got the chance to raise children of his own, to pass on what he knew. Before Michael could respond, the sound of tires on gravel announced Dr. Kennedy's arrival. Delta's ears perked up, but he remained at Hayes's feet, evidently recognizing the vehicle. Kennedy entered with the casual familiarity of an old friend, carrying a medical bag and a box of donuts. Thought we might need sustenance for this ordeal, he announced, setting the donuts on the table. Hayes grinned. Now that's the kind of medicine I can get behind. The medical examination that followed was thorough, but conducted with the easy banter of decades-long friendship. Kennedy listened to Hayes's heart, checked his blood pressure, examined his medications, all while discussing local gossip and an upcoming fishing tournament. Michael moved to leave the room, giving them privacy, but Kennedy waved him back. Stay. Since you're looking after this stubborn old coot, you should hear this too. When the examination was complete, Kennedy's expression grew more serious. Your heart's working too hard, Bill. The arrhythmia is getting worse, and your blood pressure is still too high despite the medication. Hayes waved a dismissive hand. Been this way for years. And it's getting worse, Kennedy insisted. That episode during the storm could have been fatal if Michael hadn't found you. He glanced at Michael, then back to Hayes. I'm adjusting your medication again, but Bill, you need to consider moving somewhere with easier access to medical care. Not happening, Tom, Hayes said firmly. I'm staying right here. Kennedy sighed, clearly having expected this response. At least consider getting one of those medical alert systems. If you have another episode when you're alone, I won't be alone, Hayes interrupted, glancing at Michael. God help now. The statement caught Michael by surprise. He hadn't committed to anything beyond a few days, yet Hayes seemed to be assuming a more permanent arrangement. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. Is that right? Before Michael could respond, Hayes continued. Michael's got skills this place needs, and I've got space and tools he can use. Makes sense for him to stay on, at least through winter. The old man spoke with such certainty that Michael found himself nodding along, despite having made no such decision. Yet something about the proposition resonated with him. A purpose, a connection, a way to honor the debt he owed to Robert Hayes. Well, Kennedy said, looking between them, that changes things. Still want you on the new medication regimen, but having someone here does ease my mind considerably. He turned to Michael. You know how to recognize heart attack symptoms? How to administer his medication? Yes, sir, Michael replied. Combat medic training, and I've got your number if anything changes. Kennedy seemed satisfied. Good. I'll want to see him in the office next week, but this is a reasonable compromise. He packed up his medical bag, then fixed Hayes with a stern look. This doesn't mean you can skip poker night. I'm still planning to win back what you took last month. Hayes chuckled. In your dreams, Doc? After Kennedy left, Hayes turned to Michael with a somewhat sheepish expression. Hope I didn't overstep, assuming you'd stay on. Just seemed to make sense, given your situation, all empty, and mine. Michael considered the proposal. His own cabin was just a place to exist, not a home. Here there was purpose, helping Hayes, finishing Robert's projects, perhaps finding some measure of peace in the process. It does make sense, he agreed, at least for now. Hayes's face brightened. Good. Could use the help around here, truth be told, especially with winter coming in. He gestured toward the workshop. Still want to work on that horse today? Let's do it. And they spent the afternoon in Robert's workshop, the space coming alive with activity for the first time in years. Hayes sat at a workbench offering guidance while Michael familiarized himself with Robert's tools and the unfinished rocking horse. He was working from a pattern he designed himself, Hayes explained, showing Michael a detailed sketch. Wanted it to look like a real horse, not just a issue. Said children deserve quality, even in their playthings. Michael studied the sketch, impressed by the attention to detail. He was talented. Beyond talented, Hayes agreed, had a gift. He watched as Michael carefully examined the half-finished piece. You know anything about woodworking? Basic carpentry, Michael admitted. Built furniture, did some repairs, nothing this intricate. Robert always said the wood tells you what it wants to be. Your job is just to listen and follow its lead. Hayes ran a hand over the smooth curve of the horse's back. He picked this piece of cherry special, said the grain had movement in it, like a real horse's muscles. Under Hayes's guidance, Michael began working on the horse's head, roughing out the shape according to Robert's design. The work required complete concentration, measuring, cutting, sanding, leaving no room for the intrusive thoughts and memories that usually plagued him. Delta moved between the workshop and the yard, occasionally stopping to watch their progress before resuming his patrol of the property. The dog's quiet presence was oddly comforting, a reminder of continuity amid change. As evening approached, Hayes insisted on cooking dinner, a simple but hearty stew that had been simmering all day. Margaret's recipe, he explained as they ate, said a man should know how to feed himself properly, not just survive on whatever's easiest. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The silence between them was comfortable, each man lost in his own thoughts, yet somehow connected by the shared experiences of the day. Robert would have liked you, Hayes said suddenly. You're cut from the same cloth, men who do what needs doing without making a fuss about it. Michael wasn't sure how to respond to such a compliment. I'm just trying to repay a debt, he said finally. Hayes shook his head. It's more than that. You could have called the authorities when Delta found you. Could have pointed them in my direction and gone back to your solitude. But you didn't. He studied Michael with those penetrating blue eyes. You came yourself, carried me home when your own knee was screaming. That's not debt. That's character. Before Michael could formulate a response, a flash of light in the distance caught his attention. It was brief, just a momentary glow among the trees to the west, but definitely artificial. Did you see that? He asked, sitting up straighter. Hayes nodded, his expression turning serious. Been seeing those lights for months now. Always in the same area, always after dark. Michael remembered Claire's question about strange lights in the forest. Any idea what they are? Nothing good, Hayes replied grimly. That's near the old Blackwood mine. Been abandoned for 40 years. Too dangerous to enter, according to the Forest Service. Delta had noticed the light too. The dog stood at attention, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he stared in the direction of the flash. How often do you see them? Michael asked, his military instincts awakening. Patterns meant purpose, and purpose meant human activity. Once, maybe twice a week. No real schedule to it. Hayes leaned forward, lowering his voice though there was no one to overhear. I mentioned it to the sheriff last month. He said they'd look into it, but nothing came of it. Said probably just kids messing around. Michael frowned. The old mine was at least 3 miles from the nearest road, a long hike in daylight, let alone at night. Not the kind of place kids messing around would typically choose. Have you ever gone to investigate? Hayes shook his head. Thought about it, but at my age, stumbling around the forest at night seemed like a good way to break a hip. He gave Michael a meaningful look. Been wondering if that's what got Delta so interested in your place. If maybe he saw you as backup. The theory wasn't implausible. Military working dogs were trained to assess threats and seek appropriate resources to address them. If Delta had identified suspicious activity near his home and then detected the presence of another trained soldier nearby. Tomorrow, Michael decided. We'll take a look in daylight, see if there are any signs of activity around the mine. Hayes nodded, satisfied. Figured you'd say that. That night, as Michael settled into the guest room that was becoming increasingly familiar, he reflected on how quickly his life had changed. 3 days ago, he had been alone in his cabin, existing rather than living. Now he was planning a reconnaissance mission, working on restoring a handcrafted rocking horse, and somehow becoming integrated into the life of a man he'd only just met. Yet it didn't feel strange, it felt right, as if he had been sleepwalking for months and was finally waking up. Morning brought a light fog that clung to the trees, turning the forest into a mystical landscape of half-hidden shapes and muted colors. After breakfast, Michael prepared for their expedition to the old mine. He packed a small bag with water, food, first aid supplies, and a flashlight. Hayes insisted on accompanying them, despite Michael's concerns about his health. I may be old, but I can still walk these woods, he said firmly. Been hiking this mountain for 60 years. Besides, Delta will make sure I don't overdo it. Michael couldn't argue with the determination in the old man's eyes. He did, however, insist that Hayes carry a walking stick and wear a whistle around his neck. Practical compromises that the veteran accepted with good grace. Delta led the way, clearly familiar with their destination. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally circling back to check on Hayes when the terrain grew steeper or more challenging. As they hiked, Hayes pointed out landmarks and shared stories. The lightning-struck oak where he had proposed to Margaret 58 years ago. The stream where Robert had caught his first trout. The rocky outcrop that offered the best view of the valley below. Despite his age and recent health scare, he moved with the sure-footed confidence of a man who knew every inch of this mountain. The mine entrance is just ahead, Hayes said as they crested a small rise. Used to be boarded up, but the last time I checked, someone had removed the barriers. They approached cautiously. The mine entrance was a dark gash in the mountainside, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. As Hayes had said, the wooden boards that had once sealed it were gone, leaving the entrance open and ominous. Delta stopped several yards from the opening, his posture alert but wary. The dog clearly didn't want to enter the mine, a telling reaction from an animal trained to face danger without hesitation. Michael examined the ground around the entrance, his eyes picking up details others might miss. There were footprints in the soft earth, multiple sets made by heavy boots and relatively recent. Someone's definitely been here, he confirmed, within the last few days, judging by how fresh these tracks are. Hayes frowned. What would anyone want with an abandoned mine? Michael had been asking himself the same question. The remoteness, the darkness, the privacy, all made it ideal for illicit activities. Could be a lot of things, none of them good. He moved closer to the entrance, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated a tunnel that extended about 30 feet before making a sharp turn. The wooden support beams looked rotted and unstable, the floor littered with debris. I'm going to take a quick look, Michael decided. You and Delta stay here. Be careful, Hayes warned. Those tunnels weren't safe when they were actively maintained. After 40 years of neglect, Michael nodded, understanding the danger. He moved cautiously into the mine, his senses on high alert. The air grew cooler and damper as he advanced, carrying the musty scent of decay and something else. Something chemical and out of place. At the bend in the tunnel, he stopped and listened. Nothing but the occasional drip of water and the settling of the mountain above. He proceeded around the corner, where the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. What he saw there confirmed his suspicions. The space had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory. Plastic sheeting hung from the ceiling. Folding tables held various equipment in containers. A generator sat in the corner. It was crude but functional, the kind of setup used for manufacturing illegal drugs. Michael didn't linger. He took in the details with a quick practice scan, then retreated back the way he had come. There was no point in risking a confrontation or contamination. He had seen enough to know what was happening. When he emerged from the mine, Hayes and Delta were waiting anxiously. "Well?" Hayes asked. "Meth lab," Michael replied grimly. "Looks recently active." Hayes's expression darkened. "Damn it, that poison's been hitting the valley hard the last few years. Thought we'd been spared up here in the mountains." "We need to report this," Michael said. "Does Piney Ridge have local police?" "Just Sheriff Morris and 2 deputies," Hayes replied. "Good men, but stretched thin, covering the whole county." Michael nodded, already formulating a plan. "Let's head back. We'll call the sheriff from your cabin." They began the return journey, moving at a brisker pace than before. Michael's mind raced, assessing the situation from multiple angles. The lab's remote location was strategic, difficult to find, easy to defend or abandon if necessary. The operators were likely local, familiar enough with the area to know about the abandoned mine, and they were probably armed. Drug operations and weapons typically went hand in hand. They were about halfway back to the cabin when Delta suddenly froze, ears forward, body tense. Michael immediately recognized the dog's alert posture. Delta had detected something or someone nearby. Michael motioned for Hayes to stop and be quiet. He scanned the forest around them, looking for any sign of movement. For a long moment, everything was still. Then came the snap of a twig breaking underfoot. Not an animal, but the distinctive sound of a human trying to move quietly and failing. Delta's growl was low and threatening. The dog moved to position himself between Hayes and the perceived threat, his training taking over. "Show yourself," Michael called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a combat veteran. "We know you're there." After a tense pause, a figure emerged from behind a large pine tree, a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, wearing camouflage hunting gear and carrying a rifle. His expression was a mixture of defiance and fear. "This is private property," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No, it's not," Hayes replied calmly. "This is national forest land. Has been since 1965 when the government bought out the logging companies." The young man shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to be challenged on his claim. "What are you doing out here then?" "Hiking, son," Michael said simply. "What about you?" "Hunting," came the quick reply, though the man's rifle was pointing carelessly at the ground, not carried in the ready position of an actual hunter tracking game. Michael didn't believe him for a second. This was no hunter. This was a lookout, stationed to warn the lab operators of approaching visitors. His appearance suggested they had been observed, either at the mine entrance or earlier on their hike. "Must not be very good at it," Michael observed. "Making that much noise, you'll never get close to anything worth shooting." The man flushed with anger. "Look, you need to turn around and head back the way you came. This area isn't safe." "Because of the unstable mine?" Hayes asked innocently. "Or because of what's inside it?" The young man's face paled. He raised his rifle slightly, not quite aiming it at them, but changing its position just enough to serve as a warning. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man." Delta's growl deepened, the sound reverberating through the clearing. The dog took a step forward, causing the armed man to take a corresponding step back. "That dog better stay put," he warned, his voice cracking slightly. "He will," Michael assured him, "as long as you lower that rifle and walk away. Otherwise, I can't make any promises. He's military trained, faster than you can aim, stronger than you can fight off." It was a calculated bluff. Delta was indeed combat trained, but Michael had no intention of sending the dog against an armed opponent. The risk was too great. But the young man didn't know that. For a tense moment, it seemed the confrontation might escalate. Then the man slowly lowered his rifle. "Just stay away from here," he said, backing up. "It's not worth getting hurt over." "We're leaving," Michael replied evenly. "But so should you. Whatever's happening at that mine, it won't end well. When law enforcement comes, and they will come, you don't want to be anywhere near it. Something in Michael's tone, the absolute certainty perhaps, or the implied threat, seemed to reach the young man. Uncertainty flickered across his face. "Just go," he said, finally, disappearing back into the trees. They waited until they were certain he was gone before continuing their journey, now moving with greater urgency. Delta ranged ahead and behind them, constantly alert for any sign of pursuit or ambush. "Think he'll warn the others?" Hayes asked quietly. "Definitely," Michael confirmed, "which means they'll either clear out or fortify. Either way, we need to get back and contact the sheriff immediately." They reached the cabin without further incident. Michael immediately went to the phone while Hayes collapsed into his armchair, the exertion of the hike and the stress of the confrontation clearly taking a toll. Sheriff Morris answered on the third ring. Michael identified himself and concisely reported what they had found. The sheriff's response was immediate and reassuring. He would contact the DEA and organize a raid on the mine as soon as possible. "Stay at the cabin," Morris instructed. "I'll send a deputy out to take your statement. And Mr. Foster, thank you for reporting this. That mine's been a blind spot for us, too remote to patrol regularly." After hanging up, Michael checked on Hayes, concerned by the older man's pallor and labored breathing. "Are you okay? Need your medication?" Hayes shook his head. "Just winded, not as young as I used to be." He smiled weakly, though I have to say, that was the most excitement I've had in years. Michael wasn't convinced. He fetched Hayes's heart pills and a glass of water, insisting the older man take them as a precaution. Then he helped Hayes to bed for a much-needed rest. While Hayes slept, Michael maintained a vigilant watch from the porch, Delta at his side. He didn't truly expect the drug operators to come after them. It would be illogical, drawing unwanted attention to their operation. But caution had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. He wasn't about to abandon it now. As the afternoon waned, a sheriff's department SUV pulled up in front of the cabin. Deputy Sarah Johnson, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with short-cropped hair and alert eyes, took their statements efficiently, asking pointed questions about what they had seen at the mine and their encounter with the armed lookout. "We've suspected something was happening up there," she admitted when they finished. "Had reports of unusual vehicles on the forest roads, those strange lights at night, but were short-handed, covering too much territory." She glanced at Delta, who was watching her with careful attention. "Good thing you had your 4-leg backup." She left them with assurances that the sheriff was coordinating with state police and federal agencies. "Should be a raid within 48 hours. Until then, keep your doors locked and stay alert. These aren't the kind of people who appreciate interference." After the deputy departed, Michael found Hayes awake and looking considerably refreshed. "Heard the sheriff's car," he said. "What's the plan?" Michael relayed what Deputy Johnson had told them. "They'll handle it from here. Our job is to stay put and stay safe." Hayes nodded, though he seemed slightly disappointed at being sidelined. "Feels strange, doesn't it? Calling in the cavalry instead of handling it ourselves." Michael understood the feeling all too well. After years of being the one who responded to threats, it was odd to step back and let others take the lead. "We did our part," he reminded Hayes. "Found the lab, reported it, provided intel. The rest is up to the professionals." "Guess you're right." Hayes glanced toward the workshop, visible through the window. "Think we could get back to that rocking horse tomorrow? Feels like we should balance out today's excitement with something constructive." Michael smiled, appreciating the old man's resilience. "Sounds like a plan." The next day passed peacefully, with no sign of trouble from the direction of the mine. Michael and Hayes spent hours in the workshop, making steady progress on the rocking horse. Under Hayes's guidance, Michael shaped the horse's head and neck, capturing the graceful lines Robert had envisioned in his design. The work was therapeutic for both of them, giving Hayes a connection to his son's legacy and giving Michael a creative outlet for his restless energy. Delta divided his time between patrolling the property and napping in a patch of sunlight near the workshop door. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Hayes broke a comfortable silence. "Been thinking about what happens next. After we finish the horse, I mean." Michael had been wondering the same thing. The last few days had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the military. But it was temporary by nature. The horse would eventually be completed, Hayes's health would stabilize, and then what? There are other projects in the workshop, Michael said. More of Robert's designs we could build. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. There are, and I've been thinking about something else too. He gestured toward the garden, which had fallen into neglect since Margaret's death. That plot used to feed us all summer and then some. Margaret had a gift for growing things. You want to restore the garden? Michael asked. Maybe. Come spring. Hayes looked at him directly. But I was thinking bigger than that. This place, 20 acres, good water, fertile soil, it could be more than just a retirement cabin. Robert always talked about turning it into something meaningful when he came back. A place for veterans to heal. The concept struck a chord with Michael. He thought about his own isolated cabin, how it had offered escape but not healing. How different things might have been if he'd had a place like this. Purposeful work, connection to others who understood, the quiet therapy of creating something with his hands. That's a powerful idea, he said finally. Hayes's eyes brightened. I'm too old to start something like that alone. But with the right partner, someone who understands both the military experience and what it means to come home changed. He left the thought unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Before Michael could respond, the distant wail of sirens carried through the evening air. Multiple vehicles, moving fast on the mountain roads. Sounds like the raid on the mine is happening, Michael observed. Hayes nodded. Good. About time that poison factory was shut down. They sat in silence, listening as the sirens grew louder, then gradually faded as the vehicles presumably reached their destination. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the human drama unfolding within its boundaries. About what you said, Michael began after a while. About the veterans' retreat. It's a good vision, the kind of place I could have used when I first came back. The kind of place you could help build now, Hayes suggested, if you wanted to. The offer hung in the air between them, not just a home or a project, but a future. A purpose that honored Robert's memory while creating something new and necessary. Before Michael could answer, Delta suddenly stood, his posture alert but not alarmed. A moment later, they heard the sound of a vehicle approaching, not the urgent wail of emergency services, but the steady rumble of a familiar engine. Claire's Forest Service truck appeared around the bend in the road, pulling up beside the cabin. She stepped out, her uniform dusty and her expression serious, but satisfied. Thought you'd want to know, she called as she approached the porch. Operation successful. 7 arrests, complete dismantling of a significant meth production facility. Sheriff wanted me to personally thank you both for the tip. Hayes grinned. Wish I could have seen their faces when the law came knocking. Trust me, it was satisfying, Claire assured him. She turned to Michael. The sheriff was impressed with your reconnaissance, said your description of the lab setup was tactically precise. His words. Michael shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just reported what I saw. Claire studied him with newfound respect. Well, it made a difference. That operation was supplying dealers across 3 counties. A lot of lives will be better because of what you did. Her words struck Michael deeply. A lot of lives will be better. Isn't that what he had joined the military to accomplish in the first place? To make a difference, to protect others, to leave the world better than he found it? Somewhere along the way, amid the trauma and loss, he had forgotten that fundamental purpose, had retreated into isolation not just to escape his pain, but to escape the responsibility of continuing to make a difference in a world that had hurt him. Yet here, almost by accident, he had found his way back to that core mission, had helped an old man survive a storm, had discovered and reported a threat to the community, and now was being offered a chance to create something that could help others, like himself, find their way home from the invisible battlefields they carried within. As the mountain twilight deepened around them, with Delta standing guard beside the porch, and Hayes's words about a veteran's retreat still hanging in the air, Michael Foster felt the final pieces of a new future clicking into place. Not a return to what had been before, but something different, something built on the foundations of loss and sacrifice, yet reaching toward hope and healing. So, Hayes said quietly, seeming to read Michael's thoughts, what do you think about my idea? About staying on, helping build something here that Robert would have been proud of? Michael looked out at the mountains, their ancient slopes now darkening against the fading sky. This place had called to him once as a refuge, a fortress against memory and pain. Now it called again, but with a different voice, offering not just safety, but purpose, not just existence, but life. I think, Michael said finally, that it's time to finish what your son started. Time to build something that honors his sacrifice by helping others find their way home. Delta moved to stand between the two men, his mission as a guardian evolving just as theirs was, no longer simply protecting what remained, but helping to create something new. In the quiet mountain evening, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, three soldiers from different generations and different wars found common ground in a shared vision of healing and hope. The silent guardian had led them here, to this moment of connection and purpose, proving once again that the strongest bonds are often forged in the crucible of shared struggle, and that the journey home is rarely traveled alone.